Okay, today we're going to discuss a very strange organism that puzzled researchers for centuries. And an organism that you see right here that continues to reveal secrets about some of the more bizarre plant evolution. Because here we're looking at something that technically even should not be called a plant. This peculiar life form that's often mistaken for a mushroom is known as Balanophora fungosa, also referred to as the fungus root, because for many centuries it was actually believed to be a mushroom. And this plant is also bizarre because it does not photosynthesize. Or let me rephrase this. It's a plant that forgot how to plant. It's not able to convert sunlight into energy and does not contain any chlorophyll. Yet despite of this is a flowering plant. And this is not a mushroom. But many people that walked rainforests in Australia, Taiwan, or Southeast Asia walked past this plant and assumed that this was just some kind of a really bizarre mushroom. And so in this video, we're going to discuss some of the recent discoveries from 2025 about this very strange organism, and specifically this research that shows us that this plant isn't just a bizarre oddity, and instead seems to be an ancient pioneer that shows us some of the most extreme adaptation when an organism becomes dependent on someone else. And specifically when an organism becomes a parasite. And so yeah, this is a parasitic plant. And so let's actually talk about this particular discovery, but also discuss some of the other plants we know are super bizarre, including some plants that resemble nothing like you've seen before. Unless of course you took this picture. But let's start with defining what Balanophora fungosa is and talk about its basic biology. And fundamentally this organism is extremely different from a typical plant, like your typical tree outside. Here it's classified as a holoparasite, meaning that it's entirely dependent on the host organism for its sustenance. And that's because, like I mentioned, it completely lacks the fundamental component for most plants, which is chlorophyll. It cannot carry out photosynthesis and it cannot make its own food. But it also lacks roots, which is also very bizarre for a typical plant. And so instead of drawing water and nutrients from the soil, instead it attaches to the roots of rainforest trees and then forms a flowering structure resembling a globe that's covered in thousands and thousands of tiny female flowers. You can kind of see some of them in this image. But these female flowers are actually also surrounded by male flowers. Here this is a much smaller number and you can see them on the bottom, but essentially this plant contains both genders. And in a very strange twist, when it comes to the smell of this plant, it emits a very bizarre odor. This has actually been compared to the smell of mice. So yeah, it basically stinks. And so here we have something that looks like a mushroom, lives like a mushroom, and relies on other organisms kind of like mushroom too, but is not a mushroom at all, which of course is super strange. But before we discuss this plant a little bit more, let's actually clarify something. Let's briefly discuss what makes plants plants and what makes mushrooms mushrooms, because they do belong to entirely separate branches of life. And while the main difference is how they acquire energy, plants are supposed to be producers and they're also autotrophs. They're supposed to use chlorophyll to convert sunlight into food through photosynthesis. They also contain cellulose that protects their cells, and most of them also contain roots. In contrast, fungi are heterotrophs and decomposers. They obtain nutrients by recycling dead material, or sometimes living as parasites, consuming the material directly. And they also lack chlorophyll, and instead of cellulose, they usually contain chitin, which is actually the same substance that most insects contain as well. But Balanophora fungosa is a bit of both. It's a bit of a hybrid. It evolved to mimic the lifestyle and appearance of a typical fungus, but it still contains very similar cellular structure to plants, and it of course contains flowers. But until this recent study, this plant was extremely challenging to study, mostly because of its very specific habitat and because it's actually kind of rare. And so it wasn't really until this recent collaborative research that finally mapped its unusual genome, with scientists finally tracing its evolutionary path. And turns out that this is an incredibly ancient organism. It seems to have become this way and diversified approximately 100 million years ago, basically during the time of dinosaurs. And so this is one of the oldest land plants to completely abandon photosynthesis and to survive for millions of years. But it was also discovered that it seems to have something really strange with its plastids. Plastids in a typical plant are internal cell structures that usually encompass chloroplasts and are technically kind of like photosynthesis factories. And normally in a lot of parasitic plants, as they become dependent on the host and as they basically no longer photosynthesize, these plastids start to lose genes and sometimes even disappear entirely. This is actually what happened here, and we'll discuss this in a few minutes. In contrast, Balanophora seems to have retained its plastids, even though it also is dependent on its host and cannot survive without it. But the plastids in this case are not exactly the same as in a typical plant. For a typical non-parasitic plant, a normal plastid contains 200 genes, but Balanophora only contains 20. And by the way, just as a side note, just like mitochondria inside our cells, plastids back in the days were also believed to be bacteria at first and eventually started to live inside cells of plants, creating a very specific endosymbiotic relationship. And so here for Balanophora, it still has plastids, but they only contain 10% of their genes. And well, apparently, they're not entirely useless. Here, science has discovered that the plastids seem to be still essential in various non-photosynthetic reactions, including in certain types of metabolism. As a matter of fact, they seem to transport over 700 different proteins across various cells, suggesting that they're still crucial, and also suggesting that in other plants, plastids seem to have very similar functions too. Basically, they're a lot more important than just photosynthesis. And so here, Balanophora lost most of the defining features for a plant, but retained just enough to function as a plant parasite, which shows us that when plants become parasites and give up their autonomy, they still have to have some core machinery in order to survive. But here things also get kind of strange when it comes to reproduction, because apparently different species of Balanophora reproduce entirely differently. And so even though some of the plants rely on sexual reproduction through flowers, some of them also seem to produce seeds without fertilization, which is actually exceptionally rare for plants. And strangely enough, all of the members of Balanophora that reproduced asexually were all island species. So basically the island species for some reason tend to clone themselves instead of reproducing sexually. And in this case, this seems to offer a specific advantage in various niche habitats. Basically, it allows them to spread extremely quickly, colonizing specific locations. In this case, we're talking about very dark, moist undergrowth, where we normally find mushrooms. Although here, strangely enough, this parasite is also kind of picky. It doesn't seem to grow on all plants, and only uses several tree species for its activity, which actually makes this particular plant extremely vulnerable, and which is why it's kind of rare. As a matter of fact, there's a slight chance a lot of the species here might go extinct. But as I mentioned in the beginning, this is not the only such unusual plant out there, despite of course being potentially the strangest we've seen so far. As a matter of fact, there are certain other plants that also ditched photosynthesis and adopted fungal camouflage, and basically evolved very similar features. And here one of the strangest examples is what's known as the ghost plant, Monotropa uniflora. This is also a parasitic, non-photosynthesizing flowering plant, but this one also grows in North America. And here it cannot photosynthesize either, and also survives by deriving nutrients from various roots. And even more radically, a recently discovered plant, Thismia tentaculata, seems to have gone a step further. It actually lost all of its photosynthetic genes and all of its chloroplasts. And so there are some other plants that seem to have adopted very similar lifestyles, with some of them even going to more extremes, with other plants choosing a slightly different approach. They chose to mimic fungi or mushrooms. As a matter of fact, some of them either look or smell like fungi to achieve their goals. And so, for example, this bizarre plant, cast iron plant or Aspidistra elatior, seems to contain these very bizarre flashy purple flowers that closely mimic mushroom shapes and also emit a very strong smell. And that's because they actually attract what's known as the fungus gnats, tiny flies that are usually attracted to mushrooms that this plant then uses to carry its pollen from one plant to another. And so this is actually a type of a chemical and visual mimicry, in this case focusing on resembling a stinky mushroom. And so quite a few plants seem to have adopted various techniques that don't just use traditional strategies for reproduction, but seem to rely on additional strategies involving mimicking entirely different species. But it's really the fact that some of these plants no longer photosynthesize that seems to be the strangest discovery. But why exactly does this matter? Well, for biologists, this is an excellent example that demonstrates some of the more extreme evolutionary trade-offs. Balanophora fungosa is very important because it shows us that some of these ancient parasites that lived for 100 million years managed to break a lot of plant rules and yet adapted so well to survive in a lot of different conditions. But more importantly, by studying its minimalistic genome and especially focusing on the plastids, scientists gain fundamental insights into what plastids do in cells, which can then be applied to other plants in order to help them produce resources more efficiently. In this case, some of the genetic analysis here could one day improve agriculture. But here this also serves as a reminder that evolution can be very surprising. Here it created an organism that looks like something entirely different and acts like something else as well. And it also redefines our definition of the plant kingdom. So what exactly does it take to make a plant? Clearly not photosynthesis. And so this is not just some kind of a strange mushroom imposter, it's a profound lesson in biological streamlining, surviving not by making its own food, but by perfecting the art of theft. And it also reminds us that evolution is not always about adding complexity, but sometimes it's also about streamlining and reducing complexity in order to become more effective. And because this is such a successful strategy, quite a lot of different plants seem to have evolved something very similar. But anyway, once we learn something else, we'll come back and discuss this more in some of the future videos. Until then, thank you for watching, subscribe, come back tomorrow to learn something else. Support the channel on Patreon where you can find additional videos without any ads and can DM me directly, or by joining channel membership that grants you early access. You can also support the channel by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt in the description below. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.